So today we got an inflation report, CPI of 8.5%. And so I'm going to give you a little update what's going on business cycle-wise with inflation. This is not the CPI, but instead the personal consumption expenditures called PCE, which is also right at the top of the list, probably on inflation studies for the Federal Reserve. And what you can see is that from back here, we show an uptrend of inflation. Now, granted, inside of this are smaller business cycles, creating some fluctuation, might be some noise and chaos along the way, but you can generally see inflation rose. My modeling suggests inflation rose from the 1930s into about 1980, at least into the 1970s. You can make an argument that it was really from World War II, 1940s. You can even make an argument that the Depression and World War II were something separate and therefore calculate your normal inflation towards the economy from 1950s to about 1970s, if not to 1980. Doesn't really matter. In my opinion, the trend is up regardless of where you start it. We just see higher inflation. Now, the interesting thing is you think that must be a terrible time. Well, it was generally by the 1970s, but the interesting thing is 1960s people were making money on inflation and actually quite happy. Inflation was not all that high in the 1950s, but it was creeping up, and just as it also was still higher in the 1960s and then exploded in the 1970s. Okay, so the bottom line is, though, from 1930s, 40s, 50s, into the 1970s, at least through the 1960s, you could see, at least into the 1960s, an early phase of inflation. And early is generally good. People were making more money out of their job. Their homes were worth more. They were getting paid a higher interest rate over time in their savings accounts. But the stock market, believe it or not, performed well. They made money out of their stock market. Back then, they had something called pensions, okay? And you can just see it was a pretty good time to live. But by 1980, okay, some people decided we could do better. We could be rich. We could become rich. And the rich wanted to become rich. And so we started that whole thing with President Reagan getting elected. And we're all going to work harder, smarter, and produce all you can possibly produce and get all you can get. And on a mission to print more money and lower interest rates and this and that. Okay, go get them kind of scenario. And it actually worked very well until just recently. And now at the moment, it seems like it's burning out on us. But the point is, people did quite well during that early inflation. And in the 1970s, it blew up on us in late inflation, meaning we were at risk of hyperinflation. And hyperinflation will eventually destroy a country. Okay? And so that high inflation in the 70s became a good marketing tool for the 1980s of change the country, not only at the Federal Reserve, how we do business, but within government, within politics, and who we were electing. Okay? Because people were basically just sick of inflation by the end of it. Okay? Now, that is what's called the inflation phase of the inflation cycle. That it breaks down to early inflation was good, late inflation is bad, and then it flips to disinflation of the inflation cycle, meaning we bring inflation down. And here we have, if I can draw this correctly, we have to here, okay, of what I forecast as a super cycle bottom inflation on the financial crisis around 2009. And I said it's time to start an uptrend like this, okay? But I also warned that there was going to be another recession, and there is a recession about once a decade that can set back inflation, even turn it to minus, and can set back interest rates, and apparently create even minus interest rates. And what I learned coming out of that financial crisis is that, yes, a super cycle bottom was put in place for the stock market. A super cycle bottom was put in for inflation. But the super cycle bottom for interest rates had not been put in place. It was actually right here, okay, for this virus pandemic recession was a super cycle bottom in interest rates. Now, from that recession in 2020, we put the three on the same page. Okay, another bottom in the stock market, super cycle trend already up in the stock market, but we now have interest rates and inflation also in super cycle uptrends. How about this disinflation? Okay, what we have is this trend, okay, was to be lower and lower rates of inflation. Produce more, work harder, don't get paid as much, or I should say the pay increases aren't as much, okay? Maybe push more towards bonuses for your work instead of solid pay increases. Variety of things going on there. And of course, we were able to lower interest rates, which made it easier to produce more, build businesses faster, larger, okay, help with our creativity and productivity. Early disinflation is a good time, okay? And we had a good time, but when we got into this financial crisis around 2008, 2009, we were in what's called late disinflation, which is therefore a high risk of deflation, which means minus inflation numbers, but it lasts too long. It normally coincides with a recession, if not a depression. The last deflation depression was 1930s. And there are indicators showing we were on our way in 2008, 2009 for the first depression since the 1930s. But we stopped it, we managed it, we printed more money, and we got back on our feet. Okay? Our forecast for inflation just stalled out, however, but notice the bottom stayed in place. The forecast was correct. It's just that we didn't get traction in moving it up. And then it dipped for the virus pandemic, but did not go to a new low for inflation, was not as low. And now we get the abrupt move up, and now we have a breakout of this sideways of the 2010s decade, proving the super cycle is up for inflation. And interest rates actually were down in the pandemic and then exploded, or I should say at least moving higher, for the super cycle. Okay, so now we are in the early phase of inflation that could last only this decade, and maybe we get late inflation next decade, but it's, as I look at history going back 100, 200 years, it's more likely late inflation wouldn't show up to like 2 decades from now, and maybe even a bit later. But it could be different this time around, that maybe we see the late inflation next decade. But we shouldn't move from extreme low inflation, disinflation, even deflation risk, move overnight to late inflation. We shouldn't skip early inflation. But notice this spike in inflation. We're now back to the highest in 1980s. Notice that how fast it moved. It's scaring people. But also notice back here in the 60s, 70s, big up moves inflation, big down moves, big up moves, big down moves. And it just caught us off guard that it kept moving higher. Okay? By the way, Paul Volcker was basically hired to come in and kill inflation. He did it by raising interest rates even faster than what the interest rate market was doing. He decided it wasn't moving higher enough to kill it. And he was willing to kill the economy, throw us into a recession with the hopes it was just going to clean some things up, rebalance something. And then, of course, along with the whole conservative, more free markets, more capitalism kind of scenario, it worked. We started to increase our production and we moved inflation down. It was only one component. You can still increase production and have higher inflation at times. And your creativity can be very good, actually, in high inflation times. But production is something to watch. If you're not producing enough and there's a lot of money flying around, you can wind up pushing prices higher and faster than necessary. So my gut feeling is if inflation is we've just seen a scare. And it's going to back down into this range right here. Okay? Now, I'm not saying it falls back within it. I think it's just coming near the top, near right in here. And we may establish a new higher range, okay? Something like this. And for some time. But I don't see us moving up into this range, okay? It's very unlikely we're going there this decade. Now, maybe next decade we find that somehow we just can't stop it. Something else goes wrong. I'm a little suspicious that maybe other countries and not the U.S. So long as we're a creative, productive people, keep somewhat of a free market system, somewhat of a capitalistic system, we don't have to keep it the same as today. In fact, we probably should not. I think it's burning out and going to harm us instead of help us. But we shouldn't get rid of it either. Okay? There's no reason to be anti-capitalism and anti-free market. In fact, If I had to, I would bow out of capitalism and keep free market, even if we're socialistic, because we can see evidence communist free market systems are working. Socialist free market systems are working. Okay? But I think a little capitalism is best mixed in there and keep the free market, but you don't have to be an anti-socialist to be capitalist and free market. We're going to learn more of that. Okay? But if we can keep our creativity and productivity together, if we're willing to raise these interest rates up to try to curb inflation, all right? Yes, you can do shock and awe and slam these interest rates super high and kill inflation, but you're going to kill your economy. Well, history teaches us when we're in this early inflation phase for this decade, it's very unlikely we're going to do that we will kill our economy. But it is likely and okay to raise interest rates fast enough to trim back inflation. So I'm not saying inflation's come all the way back to the bottom. I'm just saying it's going to retrace back down to maybe the top side of this range in here, maybe even up to here. And we're still going to be looking at 2.5%, 3.5% inflation throughout this decade. And then it may even go to zero thanks to a recession at the end of this decade. Next decade may be where we for some reason run into an issue where we're running 4 or 5% throughout next decade. But I'm not convinced we're in a super cycle that means we're going to go back and make the same mistakes, the same repeat, an entirely repeating history of going back to 10% inflation now in the next decade. I think things have changed. We fixed some things. We don't want it, and we have greater tools today to counter it, and just the mechanics of how we live and work can counter it. So I don't want to get scared of, I want to be against people saying this is the 1970s. It has been very briefly, 1 or 2 years here, maybe even less than a year, that we're seeing it like the 1970s. But we've got the rest of the decade, and even in the 1970s, not everything went up for the entire decade. Okay, a lot of commodity prices did not actually perform all that well from the peak of one inflationary peak in the early 70s. Didn't necessarily perform all that well going into 1980. Okay, so also be cautious of how you're going to try to hedge inflation. It may be better to just stay in the stock market and make money, because you can still possibly make more money in the stock market than you're going to wind up losing on the inflation side. Maybe a smaller return out of the stock market when adjusted for inflation, but it can be okay. At any rate, I'm very pleased with my forecast made in 2009 for a bottom in inflation, okay? And that I said, even though it wasn't performing well to the upside last decade, that was okay. And now to see it coincide with the bottom I called in August of 2020. Go look at your interest rate charts. It's the bottom so far in interest rates, okay? So an interesting thing, we are shifting gears. Something's changing around the world that's going to impact us the next few to several decades. It doesn't have to be horrible. It may be, but it doesn't have to be. And I don't think we're really setting up for that right now. My opinion, we'll see this this inflation rate work lower later this year on into next year. There may be a ripple up, but basically it's going to stabilize at a lower level, but don't be surprised it's going to be at somewhat of an elevated level compared to last decade. Past results are not necessarily indicative of future results. I'm Rich Posson for Critical Point Podcast, and I use business cycle models to help me in markets and investing and speculation, but also in the economy, even in the behavior of people. We even have a model that watches a variety of podcasts and predicts what time of month people, subscribers, followers will actually look at that podcast more than the rest of the month. Don't tell me we aren't rhythmical. Don't tell me we're not cyclical. We're not clock-like in terms of precision. We don't repeat everything, but we have a rhythm. We're somewhat cyclical. Thank you.